December 1830. On the Caribbean coast of Colombia, a 47-year-old exiled general is dying of tuberculosis. In little more than a decade, he engineered the independence of a territory that would eventually form 6 modern nations: Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Peru, and Bolivia. Yet, as his lungs fail, he is convinced his entire life's work has amounted to nothing. This is Simón Bolívar. Known across the globe as El Libertador, he waged a brutal, continent-spanning war against both the Spanish Empire and the chaotic realities of human nature. Bolívar's ultimate tragedy was the realization that while he could defeat an empire, his vision of a united continental republic was impossible to sustain against the pressures of regionalism and personal ambition. To understand his ambition, we have to look at the colonial world he was born into. Late 18th century South America was a society defined by extreme wealth extraction and rigid racial hierarchies, all tightly controlled by peninsulars, administrators sent directly from Spain. Bolívar grew up near the very top of this hierarchy. He was born in Caracas to a wealthy Creole aristocracy that owned estates, mines, and hundreds of enslaved people. But his immense privilege was paired with early isolation. By the age of 9, both of his parents were dead. At 16, he traveled to Europe and quickly married a young woman named Maria Teresa. They returned to Venezuela to start a life together, but within months she contracted yellow fever and died. Vowing never to remarry, he returned to Europe and consumed the works of Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau. On the slopes of Monte Sacro in Rome in 1805, he swore a sacred oath to break the chains of Spanish might, a promise that replaced the traditional path of a landed aristocrat with a revolutionary mission. With his inheritance secured and his family ties severed by death, Bolívar turned his back on the life of a colonial planter. He chose instead to channel his resources and grief into a decades-long war for the liberation of a continent. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and imprisoned King Ferdinand VII, a crisis of legitimacy swept across the Spanish colonies. Venezuela declared independence in 1811, but Bolívar's early military commands were disastrous. The First and Second Republics quickly collapsed, routed by earthquakes, internal divisions, and ferocious royalist cavalry. Forced into exile in Jamaica by 1815, he drafted a sweeping blueprint for the future known as the Letter from Jamaica. Defeat had forced a critical reevaluation of his strategy. He explicitly rejected the decentralized federalist model of the United States. He argued that South American societies, scarred by centuries of colonial extraction, caste systems, and forced labor, lacked the civic infrastructure for loose democratic governance. Instead, they required heavy centralization, a hereditary Senate, and an extremely strong executive branch to prevent anarchy. He carried this pragmatism into his alliances. Traveling to Haiti, he secured vital weapons and naval support from President Alexander Pétion. The condition was a promise to abolish slavery in liberated territories, a pledge Bolívar honored, freeing his own enslaved people and integrating black and mixed-race soldiers into his ranks. Years of humiliating retreat had stripped away his early romantic idealism. To defeat the Spanish, he was now willing to institute brutal decrees of war, restructure colonial racial orders, and enforce authoritarian rule to maintain military cohesion. By 1819, the war was locked in a bitter stalemate. To break it, Bolívar planned a maneuver of staggering risk, moving an entire army across the Andes Mountains to strike the Spanish stronghold of New Granada, where they least expected it. He led thousands of men through the Páramo de Pispa, a freezing, desolate pass at an altitude of over 13,000 feet. Nearly a quarter of his troops died from exposure, altitude sickness, and sheer exhaustion along the way. The survivors descended the mountains and immediately engaged the stunned royalist forces. On August 7, 1819, they won a decisive victory at the Battle of Boyaca, shattering Spanish control over New Granada. This impossible crossing broke the Spanish grip on the continent. Over the next 5 years, Bolívar and his most trusted generals orchestrated a cascade of victories at Carabobo, Pichincha, and Ayacucho, effectively ending Spanish rule in South America. This map shows the political result of his victories. Bolivar fused Venezuela, New Granada, and Ecuador into Gran Colombia. Its borders stretched from the Caribbean deep into the Amazon basin, intended as an economic and military counterweight to the United States and Europe. He used brilliant maneuver warfare to conquer a continent, but in doing so, he created a state bound together by little more than his own gravitational pull. The geography alone made Gran Colombia nearly impossible to govern from a single capital. The defeat of the Spanish military immediately gave way to the far more complex task of constructing a functional democratic republic. The new republic was physically divided by impassable mountain ranges and dense jungles. Local economies were shattered by the wars, and deep-seated class resentments boiled over. Power quickly localized into the hands of regional warlords, fracturing the fragile union from the inside. Seeing his grand project pulling itself apart, Bolivar doubled down on his most authoritarian instincts. He proposed a new constitution featuring lifelong presidencies and centralized dictatorial powers, arguing it was the only way to enforce order over the rising chaos. To his former allies, these measures looked suspiciously like the Spanish monarchy they had just bled to overthrow. Political opposition mutated into violent conspiracy, culminating in an orchestrated attempt to assassinate Bolivar in his own home in Bogotá in September 1828. He survived only because of Manuela Sáenz. A committed revolutionary and political strategist in her own right, she delayed the assassins at the door while Bolivar escaped through a window, cementing her historical title as the Liberator of the Liberator. The strongman tactics Bolivar deployed to preserve the nation became the primary cause of its dissolution, turning potential allies into bitter political enemies. By early 1830, Gran Colombia formally splintered into the separate, independent nations of Venezuela, Ecuador, and New Granada. Sick, exhausted, and preparing for his exile, Bolivar drafted his final bitter assessment of the independence movements. He wrote, "America is ungovernable. He who serves a revolution plows the sea." Today, his legacy remains deeply contested. Over 2 centuries later, his image is routinely invoked by socialists pointing to his anti-imperialism, conservatives praising his demand for order, and classical liberals claiming his fight against tyranny. The structural dilemmas he faced are still relevant. His life forces a difficult examination of how to maintain unified state institutions across vast territories without crushing the democratic liberties those states were built to protect. His physical empire tore itself apart, and the unified republic he sacrificed his life for did not survive him. But by breaking the absolute power of the Spanish crown, Bolivar succeeded in securing something permanent: the enduring reality of sovereign American nations.